stand down here for a little bit so I can get a little closer. If I'm not talking loud enough, just wave your arm. That's all I'll need to hear, see, and then I'll raise my voice. But, you know, a lot of interesting things happened last year, and one of the things that happened that really caught my attention was the unexpected and rising popularity of gardening. People started gardening for the first time. A lot of other people started saying, well, I can do more. And they were canning food and things like that. I think that's a great idea. And I hope the people that started gardening continue. And I hope the people that expanded their gardens will continue to do that in the future. I grew up in a big extended family, and every household had their own garden. And then our family had a plot of land in another part of the city, and we all went there and raised this huge garden and then shared in all the spoils. So gardening has always been a big part of my life. And so it's also one of my interests. I still garden, and I enjoy it. It's like a meditation for me, and it's a way I relax. So it's one of my great interests. And one of my other great interests is archaeology. So that's how this talk came about, where the intersection of my two interests. So one of the things I think is really interesting about looking at the domesticated crops and how they came about is this changes constantly, and mostly because of genetic research. And it seems like if I'm looking at the domestication of maize, I could look at journals every 2 months and find new articles on this subject. The amount of genetic research that's going on in crops is just incredible. So I do my best to try to keep up. This talk is one that I've been playing with for maybe 5 or 6 years, and it's always changing. Every time I do it, it's a little bit different. So to start off, how do we find the evidence that we use to study the early domestication of crops? How do we learn what kind of crops were the Native Americans using? Well, archaeological research. So this shows a big earth-moving machine stripping off some topsoil. And when we get down to subsoil, the archaeologists look for soil discolorations. Many of these are very organically rich soil, and then we look at them to determine if they're natural stains in the subsoil or cultural stains. These are 3 cultural stains. They're actually right from the center of a house that dates to about 1400 AD. In the lower left-hand corner is a hearth. In the upper right-hand corner is a refuse pit inside the house. And in between, the smaller circular discoloration is from a post that supported the roof of the structure. So we look for these types of items, and we excavate them, and inside is where we find the evidence for the plants that were used by the Native Americans. This is from a site in Salem, and in the front we can see one of the, well, this is going to work real well. We've got one soil discoloration down here with a lot of the little white flecks. The white flecks are actually freshwater snails that were harvested and used a lot for food. The archaeologist is excavating another feature up there, and you can see that she's got on one side, her left side, a lot of bags where she's placing artifacts, but behind her are a lot of white bags. And these are bags for soil that is excavated that we save and take off-site and process a certain way so we can get charcoalized plant remains from the soil. This is a sequence of slides showing the excavation of one of these features. We start on one side, excavate it, and save a side in case we make a mistake. We take out the dark soil, document it, and then remove the rest of the feature. It's then processed in what we call a flotation tank. And there are all different kinds of flotation tanks. This is a very simple one. It's a 75-gallon drum. And right in here, we put some bolts in that are supporting a grate. And lining inside that flotation tank is screening that's made out of nylon. Same thing we have on our windows. And when we put our soil in the top of the tank, the heavy artifacts will sink down, get caught in the screen here. The sediment sinks down to the bottom of the tank. And then as you see on the right-hand side, the charcoalized plant material, the very, very light stuff, comes out the funnel and goes through an extremely fine mesh material. And then we collect that and air dry it. Here's some of the material. These are all hickory nutshells. Just gives you an idea. Whoops. And then all that material was sent to an archaeobotanist who sorts through it. Spends a lot of time with a microscope. She sorts plant material from wood, identifies the type of wood, identifies the type of plants, and then with the plant material separates out the seeds to determine what kind of seeds are there. Are there domesticated seeds or are they wild? And then she actually identifies the type of seeds. This is some of her work. So up in the upper left-hand corner, those are the little things we get stuck between our teeth every summer when we eat blackberries. We have pine wood, sumac, which is a wild seed, and then maize cupules. So that's more domesticated. A cupule is a part of the corn plant that attaches the kernel to the cob. Okay? We can also learn from what are called micro-botanical evidence. I've actually never got involved with this, and upper right-hand side is a ceramic sherd that has some residue from cooking on it, and that can be analyzed to look for things like phytolith, starch, lipids. These are organic and inorganic parts of plants that can tend to be preserved for a long period of time. The phytoliths in particular are very important. They're inorganic, so they last forever, just about. And each plant will have its own signature shape of phytolith. So we can at least determine the type of plant. Now, getting to how the Indians learned about plants. Well, the Native Americans really had a phenomenal understanding of the landscape. They knew the mountains, they knew the fields, the streams, they knew where the rocks were, where the good stands of hardwoods were. They knew, they just had a very intricate understanding of their landscape. And they collected a lot of foods and learned about them through time. Things like nuts and mast, leafy plants that also produce seed grains, and a lot of fleshy fruits. A lot of items we see like listed up here are things we don't eat anymore. We don't even recognize them as food items, but for the Native Americans, they did use them. And that's one of the underlying messages here, is that we have a lot of food resources right in our yard, and we just don't recognize them as food. We don't use them as food. This past year, I let my backyard grow up, and I only mow the pathways that I use frequently, and I'm watching the succession of plants growing. And it's really fascinating, and to see a lot of the plants that I'll be talking about, I'm just seeing in my backyard, you know, and this is a subdivision that's been in existence since like the 1950s. You know, once you stop mowing, you learn a lot about your property. I highly recommend it. But during this time period, they really gained a phenomenal understanding of plants. They, learned which plants are nutritious, which ones to stay away from, which ones have medicinal qualities. And during this time, they did something that still just fascinates me, and I don't know how they did it. They made this conceptual leap from gathering plants to actually gathering seeds and saving the seeds and then planting them. I mean, how would you think of that? But they studied the plant histories, they watched the plants that they were using, and they made that determination. And not only that, but they did some other things at the same time. They were focusing on seeds, but they chose the largest seeds from the plants with the idea that when you plant those, the offspring are going to produce plants with large seeds. They also looked at the plants that were growing from seeds that sprouted quicker than other seeds and started saving the large seeds from those plants, indicating that the plants, the seeds germinated faster than other seeds, so the seed coat was a little bit thinner. So they started saving these things, and through time, they basically conducted genetic engineering of the plants. So they chose plants that were going to be producing the grains that they wanted in large size, in more seeds, in large size, more food, and also collecting the seeds from plants with the thinner seed coats so that they would germinate much, much quicker. The great thing about this is not only are you making food, but you can put it where you want on the landscape. So you don't have to go out and look for it. You just go out of your house and you know where it's planted, and that's, you know, the beginnings of gardening. And it's a really great idea. When did this all happen? There, right there. It happened on the floodplains and the terraces, right around the late Archaic time period, right around 3000 BCE. We have a change in climate so that conditions become warmer and moister, very conducive for plants. The landforms along our streams and rivers, the terraces and floodplains, become very stable, and plants start growing there. And the water from the streams and the plants growing next to them attracts the animals, and the river waters and the plants and the animals attract the people. And so people started focusing on the floodplain areas, living there, and then looking at the plants and choosing those plants and creating their own gardens. So it takes, you know, this genetic engineering of the plants was taking a lengthy period of time. So we could see, you know, right up here, this did not happen overnight, but it's a work through hundreds and hundreds of years. So there was a cultural selection of large seeds, seeds with small seed coats. And where did this happen? It began in the central Mississippi River Valley. And the central area you see in the map is really the heartland of where all of this happened, but it extends throughout the bluish area. And as you can see, it extends well into Virginia. We find a lot of the earliest domesticated crops. We find the seeds from those plants here in Virginia at very early sites, and based upon the size of the seeds and the characteristics of the seeds, we know that they were domesticated. The early domesticated crops really focused on these 7. So we had sunflower, which we're all familiar with today, although we probably don't eat as many as our birds do. And then there's marsh elder, also called sumpweed, squash or gourd, which technically is more of a gourd than a squash. Our squash today, when you think about a squash, you know, you cut it in half and you scoop out the seeds and throw those away, and you look at the flesh and you cook the flesh. But what the Native Americans had were more gourds, not much flesh. They were using the plants for the seeds because the seeds are extremely nutritious. So the seeds that we throw away, are actually very, very good for us. You've all had roasted pumpkin seeds, I'm sure. It's a real thrill in October every year. But the same with the squash seeds, all of that. And some people I know save all those, dry them, and pulverize them in a blender and use them in their foods. They're extremely rich. But they're also a suite of small grains, and all of these things grow right outside, if you just let them grow. There's chenopod, which is we call lamb's quarter, and sometimes it's often called goosefoot. And maygrass, little barley, erect knotweed. We don't even know what those are. What is little barley and erect knotweed? But if you see pictures of it, you'll say, oh, I've seen that before. Here they are again with all their scientific names: sunflower, marsh elder, the lamb's quarter, the gourds, the squash. Can anyone guess the bottom three? Erect knotweed, and little barley, and maygrass. But when we think about domesticated crops, the first thing that comes to mind are the three sisters, right? So the crops I just showed you, those what's called the Eastern Agricultural Complex, the oily seeds and the grains, those actually came to be domesticated at a very, very early time. And people learned the early horticulture practices needed to sustain those plants. These plants, especially, the gourd came very early, but the other two sisters came a bit later in time. Actually, when you think about it, these sisters, for most of history, they weren't together. The gourd came out very early, and a couple thousand years later, then we get a domesticated early variety of maize. And it's not really until maybe 4,000, 3,000 years later that the last sister shows up on the doorstep, and that's the beans. Beans are a very late arrival. We'll take a look at those three plants in their early domestication. Where did they come from? And with maize, there are three houses, three valleys, three places where the early maize came about. And right now it looks like one plant called teositine was crossbred with 2 or 3 other grasses and produced what is the earliest form, the earliest ancestor of corn that formed way down here in time. And then it spread upwards. We'll follow the yellow arrows first, okay? So it spreads upward, it reaches from Mexico to the southwest around 2000 BCE, and then begins a trek eastward. And it goes across the United States, and then finally makes its way to the East Coast. And by about 350 in our calendar, the year 350, it had reached the East Coast. However, it never really became extensively used until about the year 1000. So it was around, and the people were already practicing horticulture, so when those early corn seed came to them, they knew what to do with it, they knew how to perpetuate it. But they already had a good number of crops that they were growing. They had a lot of other plants that they were collecting from the forest. So the corn really caught on somewhat slowly. But really by about 1000 AD, that's when corn becomes a major part of the native diet. The blue arrow just signifies one thing that's sort of to keep me from remembering that when these crops are growing, sometimes you get changes taking place in an existing crop. You could have mutations take place, and that those plants can change through time. And so by the year 0, another type of early corn was coming out of Mexico and began its migration across the U.S. So then it became hybridizing with other corns. And all of the corns that were grown everywhere in the U.S., they just didn't take a seed and you grow it and get a daughter plant that looks just like the parent plant. But through time, it changes. Through things like genetic drift, mutation, other principles of evolution, it will change. And so we end up with a lot of different varieties of corn. So corn came about really early, but in our area, it comes a little later, and it really doesn't become important until about 900 AD or 1000. There's an anomaly up here, and in the Northeast, it's coming much sooner. And there isn't a really good explanation for that, except perhaps the way the scientists are learning about the plants. Because in New York, they have really focused on the phytoliths that we talked about earlier, the micro-botanical evidence. So they will look at materials that are attached to ceramic vessels, and they study those. You can radiocarbon date much of that stuff and then see what's in it. But they have very early corn showing up there. There is probably no question in my mind the corn occurs here at those early days, those times too. We just haven't really used the evidence at hand to get that information. Looking at beans, the interesting things about beans is it's sort of like independent invention. It came about in two different places quite independently. Very early in the Andean highlands, much later in the highland Mexico, southern Mexico. But beans also became a very important crop. And it seems likely that the Andean bean was then made its way up into the lower, the highland Mexico valleys where it was domesticated, most likely. That evidence isn't at hand right now, but it probably will be more available in the future as this genetic research continues. So beans actually came about pretty late in time. By that time, we already had gourds all over the place, and we already had corn. So in the Middle Atlantic, really, we don't see evidence for beans until 1500s. And the truth is, we find very, very few beans. There's very little in the archaeological record. That is one of two things happening. Either beans were not important, or maybe the conditions for preservation are not conducive for the preservation of beans. When you think about beans, if you've ever grown beans in your garden, when you first go out and pick them, about the first 2 handfuls you eat. You can eat them raw. They're very tasty. They're really good. You don't have to cook them. And when we do cook them, it's usually something light. You can steam them. You can blanch them. You don't have to cook them much. But beans don't really last a long time, in the archaeological record. The only beans that probably get there are those beans that are saved as dry beans. And then most of those end up in soups and stews. So the only way you're going to get a preserved bean fragment is if it gets charred in a fire. So corn gets thrown into fire all the time because of corn cobs. It's a good fuel. Even the gourds themselves, the shells, if they're not being used for containers, toss it into the fire. But the beans, that's a whole other ballgame. We just don't find them. And usually when I look at an ethnobotanical report from an excavation of a site, there's going to be 1 or 2 bean fragments. So we can say, yeah, they're present, but probably not many. I would bet everything that, yeah, the beans were important to these people, and they were using them a lot. They're just not entering into the archaeological record. And gourds, the last thing. Gourds really started off really early. And as I said earlier, these gourds were really collected for the containers and for the seeds that were inside. And I should also mention that the gourds came about in Highland, Mexico. However, there is a native gourd from the Midwest, and chances are it was utilized at a very early time period and probably was cross-hybridized with the Mexican varieties at some point in time. And I have actually never seen gourd growing wild, but I'm told that in the Midwest you can still see it. So most all of these early plants are still around here. It's just a matter of, do we recognize them as food? Another thing about all this, this is a subsurface feature, unexcavated, halfway excavated, and fully excavated. This is on Reserve Avenue in downtown Roanoke. The feature itself was really, it was in a parking lot, and the city engineer's office was really wonderful. And when I knocked on the door and said, you're building a parking lot? Can I step in? And they let me monitor the work during the day. And the construction crew was real nice. They would move away from an important area, and then when they left at 5 o'clock, I would excavate and get what was out of the ground. And this little feature, when I excavated it, seemed very inconsequential. It was small, maybe about that big in diameter, and maybe that deep. Who knows how deep it was before it was truncated by plowing. But as it turns out, this little feature produced the greatest assemblage of marsh elder seeds ever found outside the Mississippi River Valley. And as you can see, there's the seeds. They look just like sunflower seeds, at least to my eye and to yours, but to a trained botanist, they don't. So, and based on the size and physical characteristics of the seeds, they were determined to be domesticated. It's interesting also to note that the earliest domesticated marsh elder is now extinct. There are other marsh elders that are undergoing experimentation right now, but the earliest one's extinct. So the thing is, even in this was radiocarbon dated in 1400 AD. Even at that late date, people were practicing the horticultural planting and harvesting of seeds that were first looked at 3000 BC. So for all of that long period of time, they remained an important part of the diet, even when maize was utilized by people. But when we look at all this in terms of the state of Virginia, what do we learn from the archaeology? And I really hate to show slides like this, because the only way you really know what the slides is if you study it, and you have to see how the person built the slide and what it's saying. Basically, what this slide is saying is something unexpected, that when you are west of the Blue Ridge, or in the mountainous area of Virginia, we find a lot of corn on the Native American town sites, a lot of corn. But when you get into the coastal plain, an area that's ideal conditions for growing corn, we get very little. And that's surprising when you think about the early historic documents coming out of Jamestown. There were times when the colonists were having a really difficult time, and they received a gift of corn from the Native Americans. And that was a very important gift to them, and they viewed it as a gift of corn in a time of need. The thing is, the people down there weren't growing very much corn. They really didn't need to. We didn't really understand all this. That it's really just coming to light. And it's only over the past few years And what was really happening with the Native Americans down in the coastal area, they had corn in an early period. They did learn how to grow it. They did not have this extensive history of practicing horticulture. They never had it, but they learned it. They grew some of the corn and used it as a ceremonial food. And I don't know, if you think about your life, you have ceremonial foods. And it just depends how you look at it. When I grew up, there were certain dishes that we had Christmas Eve. And we had them every Christmas Eve. It never changed. Those things were cooked the same way, prepared the same way, eaten the same way. Same with Easter. And then, you know, I think about it, you know, and with my family, it was like, you know, summer cookouts, you know, and you go to one person's house or another, and whoever's hosting usually provides the grill and the meat, and then people bring in side dishes and desserts. And if you're my age, you remember these things. It's like hot dogs and hamburgers, nothing fancy, and then all these great side dishes, and then the desserts are Jellos, like 12 different types of Jellos, everything imaginable. Jello was never an important part of our diet, never. But when it came to cookouts, everybody brought Jello, you know? And it was a ceremonial food. It really, and so that's a simple one, but that's the way things work. And so with the Native Americans, when they gave a gift of corn to the colonists, it wasn't a gift of food, it was a gift of a ceremonial food that carried different sentiments, different ideas. But that's one of the interesting things when you start looking at the plants coming from all of these archaeological sites, and when you look at one site or two sites or three sites, you know, you just learn really presence, absence, things like that. But then when you combine the sites in a region and start looking at a broader picture, you can see some really interesting trends. So that the fact is, once you get in from the Piedmont into the mountains, the people were growing lots of corn. It was a big part of their diet. These people had been horticulturalists for over 3,000 years. In the coastal plain, they weren't practicing horticulture. They did learn it. They did grow some. Why weren't they growing? Why weren't they practicing horticulture? What was the whole thing? What it looks like now is when we look at grinding stones found on a lot of these sites in the coastal plain, and we look at the phytoliths that adhere to them, we're finding phytoliths from tuber plants. They're like lily, related to the lilies. And these are the plants we see oftentimes in the early colonial documents that say the Indians go down to the water and they pull out these plants and then they process them and eat them. And they also talk about the Indians eating tuckahoe. And for a long time we had no idea what tuckahoe was. We still don't really know for sure what tuckahoe is, but we think it's these types of plants that they're pulling from the marshy areas and then processing the tubers. So they're all related to the American water lily. I actually have never eaten it, but I think if I was living in a coastal area, I would try to find some of these. And it's simple. All around the world, people harvest some kind of plants like these. You dry them, and you pulverize them, and you make them into a flour and turn it into a bread, something like that. That about sums it up. So when we think about a lot of the plants, think about not only the Three Sisters, but this host of other wild and domesticated plants. The Native Americans gave us a great legacy, and I enjoy that legacy right now, and a lot of other people do too. We need to just recognize that, and if you get a chance, don't mow your yard anymore this year. If you have questions or something. You know, one of the, for a long time when I was learning about this kind of stuff, I would take my favorite food, and I like hot chili peppers, and so I would read about them, you know, and so I can thank South America for those. But there are a lot of other crops. We didn't mention a ceremonial crop, tobacco, for the Native Americans. That was a biggie. But we have a lot of ceremonial crops, ceremonial foods in our own lives. If we look at our lives, if we step out of our life a little bit and then look back into it, maybe it's easier to see. Yes?
Do you have comparable data for when these plants were getting started in other countries on other continents?
I don't. And well, see, okay, the United States Midwest, what we saw where some plants came about, that was one of the 10 places in the world where plant foods were domesticated. So we have Eastern North America, we have Highland Mexico, Southern Mexico. There are 3 places in South America, that's 5. Then we have a swath of land going across Africa, 6. 2 places in northern in northern China. Let's see, I don't want to forget one. That's 8. Then Southeast Asia and into Malaysia is number 9. And I skipped over one. Oh, how can I forget the Fertile Crescent? That's usually the first one we think about. Where corn, corn, wheat, and things like that were first domesticated. So each of these places had different domesticated crops based upon what was growing there. And those items did spread out into the adjoining countries.
Was it trade involved between groups of Native Americans, given what they specialized in, and they traded that for what some other Native American group might have, like before?
There was a lot of trade, and in North America, once you get north towards like some of the northern states, Wisconsin, over to North Dakota, places like that, into Canada, it's a very short growing season. So they really didn't adopt corn, but they certainly traded for it. And it was an item that they traded for with more southern peoples. So corn did go around and trade. When we looked at the corn from a site in Salem, it was interesting because the corn cobs we found, once they went through study, there were 2 types, evidently. And there was one type that was very common to the southeastern United States, and there is another type that was more common with the Midwest and over, it was actually where sometimes archaeologists refer to them as the Fort Ancient peoples. They weren't really a culture, it was an amalgamation of people, but from southern Indiana all the way into West Virginia, there was a different type of corn, and it came down and was cross-hybridized in this area. Chances are it was traded, and it wasn't traded as maybe an important item, but could have been. I don't know how I could get any further than that.
Tom, I'm curious about the role of cultivated crops versus game and oysters.
Okay, the role of cultivated crops versus gathered foods like oysters.
And game.
Yeah, okay, so oysters are really, without question, the crops are probably a bigger part of the diet. They're probably getting more nutrition out of it, but without question, people did, especially on the coastal areas, really harvest a lot of oysters. But when you think about it, the coastal areas are also those places where there wasn't an extensive history of horticulture. So they're using, you know, tubers, things like that, that are growing wild, and using items like oysters. I don't know if I can answer that anymore. Yes, sir.
How far back does tobacco go?
How far back does tobacco go? Gee, I don't know. Yeah, you know, I've never, you know, unfortunately, I did smoke at one point in my life, and I realized, you know, my body didn't like it, and I gave it up, and that was like about 40 years ago. And so I've never like maintained a big interest in tobacco. So, Ned, do you know?
I couldn't answer that question.
No. Anybody
It
have?
might be that the tobacco rustica, which was the stuff that they were growing, you know, prehistorically here, was really,
Yeah.
talk about a ritual
Yeah.
item. Now that would blow your socks off, and you know,
Yeah.
they had to wait for that Caribbean variety to get in here to
That's
make
true.
something work.
If you look at the early colonial pipes that they were smoking tobacco from, you could barely put your little finger into the bowl of the pipe. That stuff was so strong. And it wasn't until the materials coming out of South America and the Caribbean were brought up here and then planted, and it had a much smoother smoke, and it just went like a steamroller, and everybody loved it, and it was a rage in Europe. But that's more of what the kind of smoke that we're having now, I guess. Yes?
Would it be fair to assume that as Native Americans were forced off their land in the east and pushed west, they had to change their eating and growing habits too?
Yeah, when Native Americans were displaced from their lands and moved onto reservations, and even before that, when it was just the encroachment of people caused them to move, yes, that was a big impact on their lifeways. Now, with forced relocation onto reservations, they were taking people who were farmers and saying, okay, you're going to be on this place, and you're going to grow these crops, and you don't even know what they are, you know. And they would take also people who, living on the plains, who didn't practice any horticulture, and put them on a reservation and say, start growing crops. And, you know, that's a lot of what we hear about the really horrific conditions of reservations. That was one of the contributing elements. There were many, but that was definitely one of them. And with the encroachment of people, and more people coming here, and native populations catching different diseases and having epidemics and undergoing depopulation, yeah, a lot of this knowledge left them, or they abandoned it. So it is true. You had a question up here?
Yeah, I've heard of co-planting corn, beans, and pumpkins or gourds. Probably mostly more in New England, or was that a thing, or
What's that?
co-planting them all together like?
Oh yeah, planting them together. It is a thing. It definitely is. And it makes sense because the corn needs nitrogen, the beans fix nitrogen in the ground, so having them together is a good idea. You put the squash plants around there, they help to shade the corn so it doesn't dry as quick, the ground doesn't dry as quick. And the squash have these little pricklies on their leaves that the deer don't like, so it keeps the deer away to a degree. If the deer get extremely hungry, then they don't really care about the pricklies. But it can, so yeah, it is a thing. And it was a thing in the 1900s, the 1800s, and I don't know if it goes back further in time. There isn't really evidence for that prehistorically, because those three plants weren't always together until about 1400 AD. So that was the first time those three plants were together. So, but it definitely is a thing now. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Where on your overall timeline does the use of some of these grains, especially corn, come into play for the raising of beef and the domestication of beef and using it as food?
Yeah, that's really going to come much late. Well, in this continent, it's going to come much later in time during the colonial era. So the colonial era, not only was there an influx of people, but they brought a lot of animals in too that weren't native to this continent. Horses, cows, pigs, chickens, all of those were introduced. So, and when did corn become a big crop for sustaining livestock? Probably when livestock became important here. I mean, the crops were already here. The people knew that the cows would eat it. So linking those two together, growing more corn to feed the cows, yeah, that makes sense. But it definitely would have happened in the colonial era. Actually, it's kind of an interesting question because it's this period of time in the 1600s through the early 1800s. That's actually a neglected area of study, and people have just recognized that within the past 3 or 4 years. And more people are studying now the early domesticated animals that were brought into this country and what material culture was developed for them, how they fit in with other crops and things like that. So it is a really good question. We don't have an answer for that right now. But if I come back in 5 years, maybe we'll have an answer for that. We learn a lot of stuff. Yes, George?
What did the Native Americans use for fertilizer?
What did they use for fertilizer? Well, one thing goes well, first of all, when they cleared fields by felling trees with fire. So they would burn fields of like wild crops and cut down the trees and burn those, and those are the places where they started their crops. So all of that biochar, that's what we call it now, was being used as a fertilizer. With the corns, beans, and squash growing together, one of the first things you learn is you take a fish and plant it in that mound. And, you know, I don't know how many people did that, but really I think it was really, George, it was, what they would do is choose a place for the fields, burn it. That was a biochar that worked as a fertilizer. They kept their fields there in place, kept their villages in place until it became advantageous to move. The house structures they built could be rebuilt, but really after maybe 20 to 30 years, you're talking rotting wood and insect infestation. It was a good idea to move maybe 10 miles downstream, 5 miles downstream, where you're into a new catchment area, so you don't have to walk as far to get firewood. You have new trees to fell, new fields to burn, new fields to start, and you start that whole process again. A lot of the information we have on village relocation comes, a lot of it actually comes right out of the Vietnam War. And a lot of anthropologists were getting grant money, good grant money, to go into Southeast Asia and even South America, places like that, and study native settlements and who's connected to who. And out of that came this idea that with a lot of these house structures, they do become infested. They do get infested with insects. And there comes a time when repairs are not really worth it, so it's better to just relocate your village, and it's much better all around in terms of that. So these villages did move up and down the rivers. Once somebody's in place for 20 years, think about going out to get firewood. Every year you might have to be traveling a little bit further to get that wood. Who's that?
Orchards.
Orchards. When did orchards become a thing? I have no idea. And this is something that's new right now. It really is, because there was a professor at Virginia Tech who's a Native American. He studied the trees, and he's always postulated that the Native Americans would collect the shagbark hickory nuts, which are big and meaty, and they would plant those. They would create groves of forest. And I bet that's true. I really do. Because when we go and look at a lot of our large village sites, once you go into the nearby uplands, you will find, I guarantee it, the shagbark hickory. Some more research very recently being done is some biologists were looking at, is it sourwood that produces the really sweet honey around here? And they're looking at the distribution of the trees and, GIS, and guess what? It matches with the territory of the Cherokee. And the Cherokee were doing the same thing. So people were thinking the Cherokee were actually planting a lot of those trees in order to harvest the honey. Yeah. So silviculture was probably a big thing. No one really looked at it. I never heard about Native American silviculture until I met that professor at Virginia Tech. He's retired now, so I met him maybe 10 years ago. And then it seems like every now and then, every year, something new comes out. So yeah, we're learning a lot. Yes?
Any idea how Native Americans would have determined what plants and mushrooms were poisonous to eat?
How did they find out which plants were poisonous to eat? Well, I read an article in the Floyd Times. I read an article in the Floyd Times, and this was just this spring. This man gave a talk down there, and he's a biologist working for the state, studying, of all things, he studies how to get rid of plants. But he really likes plants, actually. And he gave a rule of thumb. And he said, if you put something in your mouth and your body reacts adversely to it, spit it out and don't do it again. If you can take something and chew it and swallow it and you're okay for a couple hours, then if you get sick, don't use it again. But if you start taking it and eventually it's okay, then it's probably okay for you. So, and I read that and I thought, well, it kind of makes sense to me. I'll go along with it. So, yeah. I don't do that sort of thing myself, actually. So I have tasted some plants that really, my body just said no. And I spit them out and all that. So I imagine that's what happened through time. Okay.
Are you harvesting any of your yard?
Am I harvesting my yard plants? Let's see. Well, I'm only in my second year, so it's really too early. One thing I've noticed that I was at George's property once, and we were on this back field, and it was a field that has some hay on it. It gets about this high, maybe this high, because we had to drive the truck through it, and it's red. When it's forming seed, it's red, and it's real tall. And I think you said that it was a variety of a crop, that hay crop, that was being used for the racing horses that the Oliver family had on the property. But I have some of that coming in my backyard. But I also have two other types, and I have some maygrass coming up, which is the first time I've seen that. But I'm only in my second year. The first year, it was native and introduced wildflowers. So they extended from a group like this to a stretch of about 35, 40 feet. And this year I noticed things like wild carrots coming in, some other types of plants. And the maygrass, the first time I've seen the maygrass was this year. but I'm getting a lot of tall grasses that I don't really know. So I'll have to start looking at, erect knotweed and see what that looks like in life, so I can see if any of these plants are those.
How far back does some carrots and potatoes grow, tubers in the ground?
Ooh, that's a tough question too.
I do that here, like Damascus.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of native tubers that Native Americans latched onto, a lot like many of the mobile tribes of the Great Plains, who were the people who was subsistent off the buffalo. They were actually not growing, but harvesting a lot of tubers that they were planted, that they didn't plant, but they were harvesting and using them. But potato wasn't native to this continent, so it was introduced. And I don't know when all of that took place, but it was a revolution, though. Potatoes are very important now.
Right.
Yeah, as with rice and barley. So. Okay, I think that's about it. Thank you very much.